Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around the custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case. There were some experiences he related that I had previously been unaware of regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. After this initial call, he started to call on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. Mind you, this was not someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was also much older than I was, but claimed to be very experienced with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. His testimony was really important to my case, per the words of my lawyer. I kept things strictly friendly, but I always got a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day, and that happened to be a day my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me. Honestly, I really appreciated that. After that, though, he kept on dropping by the house uninvited. He would stop by with various gifts for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to simply keep things polite. A divorce was coming soon anyway, and I really couldn't afford to make this guy mad. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key that same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after that day, he came around once again uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls altogether and took my son and dog to stay at my parents' for several weeks to avoid another drop in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he must have gotten the hint by now. It was a very quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing. Something like the zoo, I believe. We both came back quite hot and tired. I put my kid down for a nap in my bed and decided to lay down and close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later. It took me a moment to realize that something was way off here. As I was blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table. I had most definitely not put that there. There was a post-it note on it as well, something about planting it in the yard. I recognized the handwriting immediately and stood up to go splash some water on my face. I tried to decide whether to simply call my parents or phone the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized the mirror was now covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages, love notes, and calls of affection. Honestly, it really scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how all this could have possibly gotten into my house in the hour I was asleep. The front door was still definitely locked. As I went from room to room, though, there were notes placed everywhere. I mean, thousands of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets, even one inside my coffee maker. I started to grab all of them and put them into a big pile. Then I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. You know you're really cute when you think no one is watching you. I realized then that there was a security camera pointed right where that note had been left. The one that man had helped me set up months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, and I sent them a bunch of photos. My dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, this was during a custody battle. He said instead he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. That was the initial purpose, at least. This man had access, though, and could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. I realized he had copied my passwords when I was setting up the system. The only way I could figure out that he got into my house is he must have made a copy of my house key the day I gave it to him because my dog had gotten to know him. he wouldn't have bought to try to warn me either. That scared me the most. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes very quickly. He must have been right next to me a few feet away from my son while we were both sleeping. And somehow, he thought all this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what the guy was going to do when he realized he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone on the phone with another friend from out of town at about 10 p.m. The man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let in. Gone were all of the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left, an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking as well. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts as well, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had secretly befriended my mom on Facebook, and therefore was still able to see all of the photos of us she posted or shared. I saw when she left her computer logged on that they were having a conversation about how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing up. I'm more than relieved he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online now. I changed all the privacy settings on my social media accounts, and I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends. I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos. I was already traumatized enough, and I didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. When I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, we had an early dismissal, which, for those of you who don't know, meant that school went on for longer than half a day, but we still got out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class, working on some math problems when the phone rang. I joked to my friend sitting next to me, hoping it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met mine, suddenly, I got pretty worried. I was an anxious kid, so immediately I thought someone must have died. My teacher said something into the phone and then asked me, "When are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was a pretty weird question because my mom already knew when I would be getting home since she had to leave work early to be there when I arrived. I told my teacher the normal time. My teacher spoke for a few more seconds and then hung up the phone. I asked her what that was all about, and she told me my parent just wanted to check what time I got off. I didn't really think too much about it for the rest of the day. Later, when I got off the bus and walked home without much incident, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the exact look on her face when I asked her why she called the school to see what time I was getting off the bus. She looked shocked and said she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story, and immediately she started making frantic phone calls. I knew right away something was wrong. I sat down and watched some TV while my mom talked up a storm. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad arrived home early from work. About 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up as well. I was pretty scared at this point, thinking somehow I was going to be in trouble. The trooper asked me a few questions, such as whether anyone had ever tried to talk to me while I walked from the bus stop, if I'd ever seen anyone park there who didn't have a kid, or if anyone had ever tried to give me a ride. The answer to all these questions was no. I'd never seen anyone suspicious, as we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, and it was mostly old retired folks who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack a bag as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad arrived to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the trooper as well. I eavesdropped from upstairs, and my mom called me back down, and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad even taught me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything else about the situation, and eventually I forgot about it. Fast forward to today, I've been listening to some creepy narrations on YouTube when I suddenly remembered this whole incident. I asked my mom about it, and what she told me chilled me to my core. She told me that on that day, someone had called the school pretending to be my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, and all the details about my mother as well. He kept saying my mother had told him to pick me up from the bus stop because she wouldn't be able to leave work early. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. The only thing that saved me that day from being abducted was the fact that I had told that man I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which was around 3:15. But because it was a shorter day, I actually got off the bus around 1:45. I woke up in the middle of the night, but I wasn't quite sure why yet. Not only did I work 12-hour shifts during the day, which obviously wore me out, but I was one of those really deep sleepers. Even when my alarm clock woke me up, it took me a little while to realize that it was indeed my alarm clock going off. Even then, I had a really hard time shaking the grogginess. After a few moments, I realized my daughter was standing on the side of my bed, trying to wake me up. Apparently, I fumbled around for my glasses, but couldn't remember where I had left them. She was tugging on my sleeve, so I gave up finding them. My wife was out of town, so I had the whole bed to myself. Somehow, I rolled all the way over to the other side. I was so exhausted. I didn't want to do anything. I just gave up and asked my daughter what was wrong. "There's a ghost in my room," she told me, fear evident in her voice. If my wife had been home, she would have let her climb into bed with us. I, however, really didn't like when kids had to get over being scared of the dark. I was not going to indulge their fantasies about ghosts and monsters. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as ghosts," I told her. "You need to go back to bed. Daddy has to work in the morning and you can't go to school all tired either." "But there's a ghost in my room. I swear there is," she insisted. I groaned. I didn't believe this sort of nonsense, and I wasn't happy that my daughter was obviously buying into it. I rolled over and managed to pull myself up into a seated position. "Sweetheart, it's not true. Whatever's in your room is just your imagination. Now go back to bed." My daughter paused for a moment and seemed to think about what I had just said to her. "Okay, Dad. Could you at least check my room for me to make sure?" I supposed it would be the best way for me to get back to sleep. "If I check your room, will you go back to bed? I promise," she told me. I hopped out of bed and went out of my room and into the hallway. I felt like I was almost drunk as I stumbled around. I was so exhausted, I could barely even walk straight. The only thing I knew was that when I got back to bed, I might never wake up again with how tired I was. When we got to her room, my daughter jumped into bed and got under the blankets. "Check in the closet, please," she said. Slowly, I made my way over, grabbed the door, rolled it open, and looked inside. Of course, there was nothing there. I let her know this, and she seemed very pleased. "Okay, check under the bed too, will you? Go to bed right after I do," I asked her. She promised, so I staggered over, grabbed the side of the bed to steady myself, and when I had the leverage I needed, I lowered myself down and peeked under the bed. Much like I had expected, there was nothing there. I was about to straighten myself back up when the grogginess started to clear up a little bit. Suddenly, I realized something. My daughter had gone with my wife to visit her parents, and I was supposed to be in the house alone. I felt like my heart stopped as I thought back to that character now on the bed. I quickly jumped up to my feet, only to see that no one was there anymore. Nervous now, and just a little bit scared, I jumped away. I expected someone to reach out and grab my leg or something. Shakily, I made my way back to my bedroom and turned all the lights on because I was pretty scared. I repeated the same routine I'd done in my daughter's room. Checked under my bed, in the closet, and everywhere else as well. Nothing to be found. I slept with a light on that night. When my wife got home, I told her what had happened, and she had a good laugh at my expense. Now, whenever my daughter comes to my room claiming she's seen a ghost or a monster, I just let her crawl into bed with me.